The shadow's footsteps didn't stop. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. The story I'm going to share with you tonight begins with a very long submission that arrived in my email, sent in by an anonymous subscriber who goes by Nate_99. This account is a chilling documentation of how an ordinary commercial space we walk past every day can warp into a perfect, mind-destroying locked room. Turn off the lights in your room and turn down the brightness on your screen just a bit, because simply listening to this story will drag you right into the dead center of those cold, empty marble corridors. When I was in my early 20s, I was drowning under the crushing weight of student loans and months of unpaid rent. While scouring the local newspaper's classifieds out of pure desperation, a tiny, barely noticeable ad caught my eye. Night security guard needed ASAP. No experience required. $25 an hour. Location, Pine Ridge Mall. $25 an hour. Adjusted for inflation back then, it was an absurdly high amount. Furthermore, Pine Ridge Mall was a so-called dead mall that had received its closure notice 5 years prior and was completely abandoned. On the day I went in for the interview, the inside of the building was as dark and chilly as a tomb, even though it was the middle of the day. An elderly head of security in a sweat-stained uniform led me to a cramped security room in the corner and handed me a heavy ring of keys without asking a single question. He gave me exactly 3 rules to follow and nothing else. First, stay inside the security room from midnight until 6 a.m. Second, at exactly 2 a.m., take a heavy flashlight and do exactly 1 patrol around the main corridors of the first and second floors. And third, if, during your patrol, you hear the sound of someone mumbling from inside one of the shuttered, empty stores, absolutely do not shine your flashlight or go inside. On my very first night, I realized in my very bones why people call these abandoned spaces liminal spaces and why they fear them so much. Because this massive concrete labyrinth, which should have been overflowing with tens of thousands of people, bright lights, and loud music during the day, morphed into a perfect vacuum completely severed from the outside world at night. The olfactory uncanny valley hit me first. Layered over the smell of stagnant, rotting dust and moldy cheap carpet, there was a very faint yet undeniable scent of sweet cotton candy mixed with swimming pool chlorine. Even though there wasn't a single swimming pool or cotton candy machine anywhere in this colossal mall. For the first 2 weeks, I simply had to battle extreme boredom and the horrific hallucinations born from sensory deprivation created by my own brain. Walking down an empty, 300-meter-long corridor with closed shutters on both sides causes your sense of spatial proportion to completely collapse. The darkness just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam seemed to undulate like a liquid, giving me the terrifying sensation that the dark itself was staring back at me. Because the floors were entirely smooth, 90s-style artificial marble, the sound of my heavy boots echoed deafeningly throughout the entire building. Tap, tap, tap. But at a certain point, the rhythm of those echoes began to shift in a way that logically made no sense. Even when I stopped walking completely and held my breath, exactly 1 second later, another footstep would echo from the dark end of the hallway far away. Tap. It felt as if the building was mocking me by mimicking my stride. Or rather, something was hiding in my shadow, perfectly imitating my exact gait. Everything completely shattered on Thursday of my 3rd week, at exactly 2:15 a.m. I was patrolling the old food court area on the 2nd floor. The plastic chairs were flipped upside down on the tables along with cobwebs, and the McDonald's and Sparrow signs hung skeleton-like, resembling the bones of dead animals. Right then, music suddenly began pouring out from the ceiling speakers across the entire building. Even though I had definitely completely shut off the main breaker board when I clocked in, bizarre, endlessly dragging elevator music was playing from the dead, unpowered speakers. Feeling the hairs on my entire body stand on end from pure terror, I approached the neon arcade area next to the food court, which seemed to be the epicenter of the noise. The inside of the arcade beyond the closed iron grate should have been absolute darkness, but a faint blue light was leaking from the deepest corner. I held my breath, clicked the power off on my flashlight, and pressed my face right up against the cold iron grate. The screen of an old, abandoned Pac-Man arcade cabinet in the corner was glowing brightly. The screen was flickering violently with heavy static. And what was even more shocking was that something was standing completely stiff directly in front of the machine. At first, I thought it was an intruder, but that thing was not human. It looked at least 2 meters and 30 centimeters tall, and it had stark white skin with no clothes on. No, it had a pale, glossy body with a plastic texture. It was a department store mannequin that belonged in the clothing shops on the first floor. With its finger joints completely mashed together, it had its hand resting on the joystick, staring piercingly into the game screen with a blank, egg-like face devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth. I gasped like a wounded animal and began stepping backward. The survival instinct to get the hell out of there and lock the steel door of the security room completely took over my brain. But in the exact moment I took one careful step backward, crunch. I stepped right on a shard of a broken light bulb on the floor. That explosion-like sound echoed like thunder across the entirely silent dead mall. In that fraction of a second, the head of the mannequin standing in front of the arcade cabinet snapped toward me at a grotesque angle completely impossible for a human spine. There were absolutely no facial features on its head, but I could feel deep within my soul that the chunk of plastic was looking at me and smiling with absolute ecstasy. It did not bend its joints to walk. Maintaining a stiff, military attention posture, it started gliding toward the iron grate at unbelievable speed, as if sliding on invisible rails. I threw my flashlight away and sprinted into the pitch black, screaming like an absolute maniac. My lungs felt like they were ripping apart, and I could taste metallic blood in my mouth, but I couldn't stop. Because the horrifying sound of scraping plastic behind me was rapidly closing the distance. The speed of that thing was vastly superior to human running. Vaulting down the escalator leading to the first floor lobby in a single leap, I threw my entire body toward the security room. Bam! I slammed the heavy steel door shut and threw all my body weight into sliding the double deadbolt locks into place. A massive impact that felt like it would rip the door off its hinges hit once, and then the mall sank back into a suffocating, dead silence. I sat slumped on the floor, shivering violently with my back pressed against the door. But the horror was not over. From the very narrow gap at the bottom of the security room door, a soft, shuffling sound began to emerge. Dozens of stark white, flattened plastic fingers, completely lacking a human skeletal structure, were slowly creeping under the gap of the door. They bent bizarrely, fumbling blindly across the floor like snakes, as if desperately trying to reach up and pick the internal locking mechanism. And from the exact opposite side of the door, merely 10 centimeters away behind the steel, a voice mixed with tearing radio frequency static whispered, "It's time for the patrol. Open the door. The boss is going to be mad." I covered my ears with both hands and screamed silently with tears streaming down my face until the first rays of sunlight hit the window at 6 a.m. As soon as the sun rose and the sound of cars on the distant highway began, those grotesque fingers slithered out from under the door like a dead bug shrinking away. I immediately kicked the door open, sprinted to my car without looking back even once, drove away, and never went anywhere near that place again. People always think of dead malls as simply abandoned spaces waiting for demolition. But the truth I learned deep in my bones that night is entirely different. That massive space was absolutely not empty. In the massive void left behind by humans, something unexplainable creeps in, coils up, and quietly lives and breathes, building its own grotesque world. If you ever find yourself walking through an empty underground parking garage or a dark, shuttered hallway, keep this in mind. Do not stare too deeply into the dark, because the exact moment you acknowledge the abyss, the empty space will begin to stare back at you.